All right, folks, let's get started. Well, 1920 by 1080, 1280 by 720, 720p, 1080i, 1080p. I'm sure most of us in this room are familiar with those numbers. But whether you were working with modern computers, playing video games, watching movies, or maybe some lucky people in this audience have an SGI system from the 90s that's high resolution. But I'm sure some of you may have also asked, where did those numbers come from? Was it some Silicon Valley coder who was working on some raster driver and picked some arbitrary numbers, just, tested it out and then just stuck? No. The actual answer to that is quite a bit more complex. And so today, I'd like to tell you the story of HDTV from the very beginning and how it integrated and forever changed computing technology. So maybe you've seen some of the videos like these, such as New York City in 1993, Tokyo in 92, Toto live at Montreal Jazz Festival in 91, or Sony's Metamorphosis in 1990. All these were filmed in HD and kind of give you maybe a hint of how old HDTV is. But before we go any further, I'd like to start with a little bit about us. I'm Op, and this is Nova. The Op Workshop has basically three emphases right now. Archival. Op Workshop is kind of a branch of a YouTube channel I started called Really Interesting. And on Really Interesting, we convert analog digital video from various obsolete formats, from footage that's been lost or ignored or generally just need a high quality digitizing. One of our emphases was analog HDTV from the beginning. Not many people were converting that video at the time I started. And after traveling literally the world, talking to directors, talking to engineers, people who originally worked with this, not only was I able to gather a lot of information, but I was also able to gather a large amount of media and brochures. And I believe we have the largest early HD archive in the United States, at least in a personal collection. We also do a lot of research. We try to get old technology to work with new technology and new technology to work with old technology. That's not always the same challenge. In addition, we try to build we've been trying to build community. We have a Discord that's pretty active, and there's people in there that are professionals, there's hobbyists, there's everybody in between, people who just want to learn about electronics or people who just want to learn new things. And then, sorry, let's do questions afterwards, sorry. And then we have, of course, we're here. We're doing outreach. We'd like to do more outreach like this. And if this wasn't clear, this is my very first time doing this. So thank you for being our first audience. I really appreciate this. Thank you. Thanks. But don't worry, guys. I practiced. I made sure that this would be fun for everybody. So with that being said, let's begin with audience participation. I have a question for everybody. When did research first begin in HGTV? Does anyone have an approximate year? You in black. That's very close. A little earlier. You in the black over there? There is a French system, but that was an external development and a little bit outside the scope of this talk. But as far as what derived the modern HD, it was actually the mid-60s, so you're very close, during the Tokyo Olympics. So our story begins in 1964 in Tokyo. The Tokyo Olympics were a big deal for Japan. This was the first time that Japan had the global stage since World War II. Since World War II, they really rejuvenated their industrial society. Their engineering prowess grew immensely. And this was their first opportunity to really show what of a power they've become since then. So they made sure to debut a number of firsts as part of the Olympics. They produced the first live television transmission to the world via satellite. They also did the first Olympics games in color. They also did the first close mic coverage for the players on the field, along with slow motion. In addition, they had the first timer capable of accuracy to 1/100th of a second. Needless to say, all this technology came together and created a wonderful experience, and it had the most viewership of any previous Olympic Games. It was extremely successful. So Japan took this as a key research opportunity. They saw this, they saw the results of the game, and they looked at it, and they said, okay, what technologies do we miss? How could we have, you know, come up with other technologies that would have increased the communication of the game? In addition, what sort of technological advancements were applied to the game that could then be the games that could be applied to other places in society? For example, for the latter question, they took that 1/100th of a second timer, which was developed by Seiko, and that had a quartz reference. They miniaturized that, and Seiko released the first quartz referenced watch, the Astron. So NHK, the Japanese Broadcast Corporation, they were obviously a big part of this, and they asked similar questions. Specifically, they said, what worldwide technological issues would be experienced in the future? And they, being a big engineering term, definitely had interest in this from the perspective of Japan. How could Japan be proactive about these issues? So looking at the results of the games, considering this question, they came to some conclusions. They first concluded that the technological advancements increased the transfer of information, and that looking towards the future and on a broader scope, that society in general is moving away from one that values industrial advancement to one that values the transfer of information, one that values the accessibility and the availability of information, a concept that many of you may think of the information superhighway in the 90s, right? So the NHK then started research into better and more efficient communications to keep Japan, or to make Japan a future world leader. So they looked at their current technologies, right? And this is 1960s. They didn't have a lot of digital technology at the time. So they looked at what was the most efficient form of communication at that time, and that was television. So they were looking at a better form of television. Thus, the NHK began research into a koinshitsu, or high-quality television system, and that was initiated by Keiji Suzuki and Tatsuharu Nomura, and these were the two engineers that were mainly behind the satellite broadcasting system used during the 1964 Olympics. By 1967, they put together a case use study throughout Japan that asked three major questions. Why do people watch TV? Why don't they watch TV? And what is the people's use for their TV? Complex questions when you think about it. Of course, they developed these questions, but they also wanted to do experiments. For this, they brought on a young engineer by the name of Takashi Fujio, who developed a number of simulations with lenticular lenses, lights, and filters, because there was no digital emulations at the time, obviously. So how do you develop HDTV, right? So they had these lenticular lenses, all those things. But one of the major trials that they did was this one, the projector and curved screen. They put a subject, they sat a subject down in front of this curved screen. They put a projector over their head with a wide-angle lens, and they had films with various subject matter, such as amusement park or field of flowers. And they had film running at various frame rates, along with different filters in front of it, and adjusting the brightness and those sort of things. And what they would measure is the participant's tilt. As the participant would tilt towards the screen, they came to the conclusion that they were more sucked in. They were more involved with the images on the screen. So therefore, a better result would be one where someone tilts very close. You know, like if you're playing a video game, right, and you're like this. Very similar idea. So what parameters they were looking for, right? As I mentioned, they adjusted the frame rate, they adjusted brightness, those sort of things, along with resolution. And some of these things that you would think they'd test. But in addition, they test some psychological factors, such as texture. strength, and beauty of the image. And Takashi Fujio is quoted as saying that the goal of high-definition television was to develop a television with a rich sense of emotion, not necessarily one that allowed you to see every detail. So after all these trials, the NHK came to some rough conclusions. Specifically, they found that large screen TVs were widely enjoyed. In addition, they found that the average viewer's periphery, where they saw the most or reacted the most to information, was 30 degrees horizontally and 20 degrees vertically. In addition, most people enjoyed sitting 2 to 3 screen heights back from the screen. So if your screen is about 20 inches tall, most people would sit 40 to 60 inches away. However, a subset of people got nauseous sitting closer than 4 screen heights away from a moving image. In addition, they also tested concave screens. They also tested 3D screens. And both had positive results, but not as positive as a large screen or higher resolution and some of these other factors. So now they started to put some of these together. So they took a person sitting 3 screen heights away with a visual response of about 30 degrees horizontally and 20 degrees vertically, and that created a television with about a 5:3 aspect ratio. In addition, this reflected some of their subjective results in other tests. So they came to the same conclusion through multiple paths. In addition, they also came to a conclusion that the ideal vertical resolution of a high-quality TV would be at least 1,000 lines for a person of normal vision sitting 3 screen heights away. They knew at the time, though, that there were bandwidth limitations. So they knew they needed to use something called interlacing. Interlacing has artifacts, such as interlaced Twitter. The way to overcome that is to slightly increase the resolution. They pushed it to 1,100 lines then. Now they had 1,100 lines, but because this was still television, they wanted to maintain compatibility with standard definition standards around the world, such as NTSC, which is used in America and Japan, and PAL, which is used in Europe. So they found the nearest ratio of integers using both of the formats, and that came out to 1,125 lines. So the results of these 1960 studies were conclusive that a high-quality television system would benefit society. So the 70s rolled around, and in November of 1970, the NHK started a high-definition television study group with a number of Japanese manufacturers. Basically, they gave their initial results to the manufacturers and said, make some hardware. So within the next couple years, a number of manufacturers produced some prototype displays, cameras, and even telecines, which would take film and create video. So let's take a look at some of these pieces of hardware. So here's one of the first prototype HDTVs. They did this by taking 3 4:3 aspect ratio standard definition TVs, so like your parents' old TV, sticking them in a box with a trick mirror, and that would create a widescreen, high-resolution image, as you can see on the right. So that was a 26-inch wide television, by the way. They also made a laser projector, which is really cool. And it would allow you to project a large high-resolution picture on a screen so that they could test the response of very large screens. So with these experiments, with these results, the NHK in 1975 had a preliminary HDTV standard. And the standard is as follows. On the right side is the modern 1080i standard that most of us are familiar with. As you can see, the numbers are very similar. The only real difference is the number of active lines, which is a visible picture, is slightly lower on the old standard. The refresh rate is a nice round number. The aspect ratio is a little bit around 16:9, but overall it's very similar, 50 years ago. And on the right-hand side, you can see some of the hardware that came out of these initial 70s standards. So we have now a standard. We have cameras, we have displays, we have all these elements, but we have to remember that this was still to communicate effectively. So the next step was to be able to communicate this effectively and see if that's even possible. So the NHK went to work on that. They started developing a transmission standard. So standard definition is only 6 megahertz in bandwidth, typically. HDTV can be up to, in this iteration, could be up to 90 megahertz in bandwidth. So there was some trouble here. Specifically, at this time, this is again the 1970s, most television transmission, or all television transmission, was done terrestrially. That is, there was an antenna put outside that would broadcast omnidirectionally. This had a lot of environmental issues. It would be affected by the weather and those sort of things, and it wasn't very efficient. So as bandwidth increases, power increases. So that wasn't a great way to look forward. Luckily, Japan was looking at alternatives at the time for their standard definition stuff, and they had developed a satellite which was deployed in April of 1978. And they thought we should develop a system to do satellite transmission of HDTV to prove it. So the first transmission of HDTV occurred on November of 1978. It used a system called Hilo-PAL, or half-line offset phase alternating line. And this was a composite format that took the best parameters of NTSC, PAL, and then added some additional benefits, such as offsetting the chroma by a half line to reduce artifacts. If a lot of you work with standard definition, play video games or whatever, you'll see like noise and those sort of things. This largely eliminated that. So as you can see, NTSC is on the right-hand side, and the spectra is very similar to that of Hilo-PAL. It's just much wider. Now, the downside is that it was an amplitude modulated system, and it was a composite format. And the result of that is that it used a lot of power, hundreds of watts to transmit. It also was very noisy. So the NHK went back to the drawing board. And by March of '79, they came out with a second transmission system called the YC, a YC separated system, luminance or chrominance. So what they did there was they actually took two satellites, or two dishes, and transmitted to a satellite across two different channels. So they took the black and white picture and the color picture and transmitted it completely separately. Then on the receiver, it combined those again and created a full picture. That used frequency modulation. It was low noise, and the picture quality was great. However, it required two satellites. Again, it required two dishes, and the receiving end of things needed to support two channels at once, requiring a very large dish. And it required 100 megahertz of bandwidth, which is ridiculous. That's way too much bandwidth for one channel of HDTV. So they went back to the drawing board again, and they came up with a third transmission system, which was used between '81 and '82, called TCI, or time compressed integration. And so that took the best of the YC system and made it into kind of a composite system, where they took the black and white picture, sent it first, then took one of the color difference channels after that, and then on the next line, they took a black and white picture and added another color difference signal. So you'd have black and white, red, black and white, blue, black and white, red, and it would go like that. And then on the receiving end of things, it would frame buffer this, it would store it in digitally, and then it would extend the color across both lines. And that way you could reconstruct the full image. It would have half the color resolution, but it fit within the original 30 megahertz bandwidth, and it was low noise, and the receiving end of things could have a small satellite. It was great, but it still wasn't perfect. However, these trials showed that a broadcasting was feasible. So now you have cameras, you have displays, you have a test broadcasting system. What's next to make a full production system in this HD format? Does anyone have any guesses? In the green? Pretty much. We need to be able to record stuff, right? So this hardware is actually shown internationally for the first time in LA in 1980, but they didn't show any recorders. They just brought the cameras, the monitors, and said, look at these pretty pictures, and everyone was like, ooh, this is great. But it took another few months, and in 1981, April of 1981, in Japan, there was kind of a surprise announcement by Sony that they have developed two VTRs, videotape recorders. One used a YC separated system using the transmission system. The other one was an RGB VTR, recording RGB separately. What's interesting was that the panel that gave this announcement was constructed of people from around the world. Not only was there Takashi Fujio, our friend from the very beginning, but there was Norio Oga, one of the the Sony director who 1 week earlier announced the CD to the world. Joe Flaherty, he was the VP of CBS Labs in America and the main proponent of HDTV. And also Francis Ford Coppola, the director of Apocalypse Now and The Godfather. So they were all here talking about how great HDTV could be, with Francis Ford Coppola specifically saying that he would want to do his next HDTV or next movie in HDTV. Unfortunately, I don't think that was the case. Now, this hardware was not sold. It was a prototype system, and specifically the YC separated VTR went on a worldwide tour. It went around the US and went around Europe, and there was some initial footage shot on it. And it was mostly used to go to like US Congress and say, hey, our HDTV system is pretty cool, like you should standardize it and accept it. Now, it took a few more years until a second generation system came around called the HDV 1000. That's this guy here. It was a two-piece unit. It had a tape transport and a separate digital time-based corrector signal processor. It weighed 475 pounds, and it drew 1.3 kilowatts or more. Now, this was based off of standard definition hardware that already existed. It had 4 playback heads. It was basically 4 standard definition VTRs in one. It stored 2 channels of green, 1 in red, 1 in blue, and each channel is 10 megahertz. So the 2 green channels, which were 10 megahertz each, were then time compressed to create one 20 megahertz channel. That was done digitally. There's 8-bit ADCs in this hardware running at 34.54 megahertz and storing this data into 1 kilobyte of RAM per channel per line. So if you combine both channels, that adds up to about 18, and you take away some of the timing and stuff, that adds up to about 1,800 lines of resolution on the green channel. Now that whole ADC system was duplicated per channel, per input-output. So that's 8 analog to digital converters and 8 digital to analog converters. And all this hardware in that chassis was able to store 8 lines out of the 1045 that this system used at a time. So that huge piece of equipment could only store 8 lines. And here, right here is actually one of the boards, one of the DACs from it. So, and you can see kind of like the artifacts of this tape as it's starting up on the right-hand side. Okay, so now we have a VTR that's actually working. People are making like not just R&D, but music videos. They're making movies. They're TV shows in this hardware. So now the broadcasting question needs to be revisited. And NHK wanted to make a system that would actually be applicable to the world. Now, by the mid-'80s, other countries were looking at satellite transmission too. And the general consensus was about an 8.1 megahertz channel bandwidth. But all the previous tests were done from with a bandwidth of 30 to 100 megahertz, which is an order of magnitude higher. So how do you take these initial tests and cut it down to fit into an 8 megahertz channel? Well, you do that by something called MUSE, multiple sub-Nyquist sampling and coding. It was built from the TCI experiments. So they took the TCI experiments and then shrunk it down and encapsulated it in a bunch of digital data. And the way they did that was by taking 4 samples in kind of a square pattern. So they take a sample or a pixel and record it on the left. Then they move 1 pixel over to the right, move down 1, move left 1, move up 1. And they do this like kind of clockwork cycle. And then each sampled picture would then be a quarter resolution. This quarter resolution picture was then sent, again, encapsulated in digital data such as digital audio and motion vectors, kind of reminiscent of MPEG in the future. And then on the receiving end, this picture, which was sent via analog, was then digitized again, stored into a frame buffer, and then the 4 frames were then added back together again, and motion vectors applied, those sort of things. So this resulted in on moving pictures, a resolution of about a quarter, depending on the motion vector effectivity. And for still pictures, you get about 100% resolution. It was great. Now, I understand that my explanation may have been kind of complex. It's a complex system. Luckily, NHK knew their viewers, knew their engineers. So they produced this short little explanation of how the MUSE system works. And I think it will be very memorable for all of you.
To transmit high vision, NHK has developed a new system that allows scanning of picture elements by alternate sections and on alternate lines. Each picture is scanned 4 times. It's called MUSE, or Multiple Sub-Nyquist Sampling Encoding. As each picture is resolved into 4 parts, 1/4 of the total information is transmitted at one time.
Memorable. So yeah, and the person that drew that actually did like Earth, Wind, and Fire covers. Pretty interesting, right? So obviously, this MUSE system, what made it difficult was that now you had this whole frame buffering system. You had this whole complex computing system using motion vectors. Things were going more digital. And it was very apparent that digital was the future when it came to making high-definition television real. So this was being considered in multiple places in the HDTV development process, and nowhere was this more visible than in the videotape recorders. And in 1985, Hitachi actually showed a prototype digital recorder, as shown here at NAB 85. The resolution was 1120 by 1035. It had 8-bit color, and it used TCI, just like the transmission system in MUSE. And that was able to store 460 megabits per second to tape. It used run length encoding to increase to reduce the number of errors. And actually, this is one of the first uses of run length encoding, since Hitachi actually made the patents for it about 2 years earlier in '83. But this system was completely limited by tape density. That's what defined the parameters here. So just 1 year later, in 1986, the CCIR, or the United Nations group that sets a lot of standards for Europe, defined what digital HDTV should be worldwide. And they said it should be at least 2 times the width and 2 times the height of standard definition. In addition, it should be wider than the current 4:3 aspect ratio of standard definition. And Hollywood wanted 16:9 for reasons outside the scope of this presentation. NHK then came up with this equation. They took the standard definition of 720 by 480, multiplied it by 2. They then normalized it so that the pixel density was normalized. And then they expanded that to a 16:9 aspect ratio. And that ended up with 1920, creating a resolution of 1920 by 1035. Very familiar, right? So there is a problem now. If you're going to take this HD standard, this 1920 by 1035, recorded in an 8-bit format, it would require 1.188 gigabits per second to record to tape in 1986. Remember, this is like a couple of years after the Commodore 64. Commodore 128 was like coming out. So this is pretty intensive stuff. So you had really 2 choices on how to store this: either data compression, which was extremely computationally difficult and probably impossible at the time, or data storage, which was extremely bandwidth intensive, which was also considered impossible at the time. In fact, Hitachi reflected on this standard in February of '87, and they said, this may not be possible anytime in the next few years. Closer to reality standard would be about 891 megabits per second. What they didn't realize was that Sony was working behind the scenes and had a VTR a couple months later that recorded 1.037 gigabits. And as you can see on the right, if you can read French, they were trying to show this VTR to French museums to try to make digital museums, right? But a couple months later, they then modified this format and released a 1.188 gigabits VTR, meeting the CCIR and HK standard. And the reason this was possible was because Sony had Sony Chemical Corp, and they developed a lot of their tape standards in-house. So not only was the tape very difficult to make and cutting edge, they needed to do some crazy stuff in order to make all this data recording possible. They required 2 times the heads, running at 2 times the speed, with tape moving 2 times as fast as the analog format. That's a 7,200 RPM spinning head with tape running at 32 inches per second. The thing sounds like a jet engine. I think some of you may have heard it today. 2 passes of for each frame, it required 2 passes of the heads. And because of that, it needed a digital frame store for the full HD resolution. And in fact, the hardware has multiple full resolution frame stores in full HD in 1987. That's a lot of memory. In addition, to make all this high data rate possible on tape, there's a lot of dropouts and all these issues. So they devised a data redundancy system and data air checking and all that based on CD, kind of. It used the non-return zero data shuffling scheme for each of the 8 channels, and used Reed-Solomon data parity system for error correction and inner-outer system, just like CDs. In fact, it even used a blocking system just like CD, where each block is 13 TV lines, and 2,560 blocks created one full HD frame. And the result of this was a highly reliable format with very few errors. So all this came at a cost. No, this is in 1987. If you're going to have multiple frame stores and this sort of data rate, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And that came in the form of cost. So if you wanted to buy an HD 1000 in 1988, that would run you about $600,000, not adjusted for inflation. If you wanted to buy one tape with 1 hour of recording time, that would be $736 in 1991. So Japan saw this as an issue, and they had a group called MIDI. And that was a government group that really brought a lot of their companies together to work on standards and improve technology as a country. They came together and subsidized a lot of R&D to bring down the price of RAM, to bring down the price of processors, silicon, those sort of things for this. And as everything went more digital, there were other problems that were found too, such as data transfer. One such example of that is for this production called Infinite Etcher. That was rendered with 3 SGI Iris 4D systems by a company called Picture Perfect in New York. And they couldn't afford the actual HD VTR. So what they did was they'd render out to magneto-optical disc each frame, and then they'd go via taxi to a studio down the street where they'd render out to tape. And they'd rinse and repeat for however many trials you needed to end up with this output. So Japan saw that as an issue too, and they put funding into developing a BISDN system. And we can thank a lot of that research to develop the ISDN system that a lot of our early internet infrastructure used. So we've been focusing mostly on Japan, but Japan wanted to make this an international standard, right? And if you want to make an international standard, you got to get everybody on board, all the countries. So they've been going to various meetings and standardization attempts from the early 70s. And by 1986, they really wanted to make this a standard. So the ITU, which we previously talked about, CCIR, ITU, they attempted to finalize the HD standard. The NHK walked in. They had an HDTV to European converter, and the general response was, it's great. It works great. And NHK even presented their MUSE broadcasting system. They walked in, they're like, we got the full system. We're ready to go. However, Europe wasn't ready to go. They came in with 19 alternative systems that were homegrown, were fully done within Europe. No Japanese involvement at all. Now, specifically, the Western Europeans weren't very happy about this. Yugoslavia in particular, they halted all the discussions. They said, we're not even going to think about the Japanese system. We want a European homegrown system. As a result, it was considered, this 1986 meeting, the most acrimonious meeting in ITU history since 1865. That was an actual quote by someone who attended. So the Americans were pretty on board from the beginning. You know, Joe Flaherty, as we previously mentioned, was pretty in it. There was a bunch of American push for the Japanese standard. However, they kind of got wet feet. You know, they were kind of like, we don't really like this either. Maybe we should work on our own systems. So Ronald Reagan's Star Wars efforts created a group called DARPA, and DARPA put in $30 million of grants to develop an American HDTV system. In addition, Congress was contemplating putting about $300 million into a system. Well, companies like money. And so a lot of companies started to throw their hat into the ring. And at its peak, there were 87 different competing HDTV standards. So some of the proposed standards are as follows: 1250-50i, 1050-60i, 1125-80i, 1575-5997i, and 787.5 59.94p. by companies you may be very familiar with. So, needless to say, there was a lot of infighting at this point. But one of these alternative standards was becoming fairly popular, actually, and that was 787.5, which later became 720p. So that's mostly because a progressive standard was very popular with the computing industry. That's because it was a lot easier than this interlace system to interface with. So let's look a little bit at the computer industry, since they've been very uninvolved with this and kind of working separately. Let's put the spotlight on a company called Symbolics. Symbolics was a Massachusetts company that back in the early 80s was very young, was just starting out, and they hired a small team from a company called Triple-I in 1982. Triple-I was one of those Silicon Valley companies where people would go in the middle of the night, just start building things. Maybe it would be commercially applicable, maybe it wouldn't. They did computer music, they did early OCR experiments. In addition, they purchased the one and only Funly F1 computer system, and they built their own 6-bit 1024 line frame buffer, which was the world's first in 1978. Just for this frame buffer, which used multiple of these cards shown on the right, it cost $140,000 US in 1978 money for Intel 2147 4K SRAM. They kept it in a vault until it was used because they didn't want anyone walking off with it. It used power supplies that were capable of giving about 600 amps at 5 volts. And since this was discrete from HD at the time, they were outputting to film. And so, but they wanted to preview what was going out to film. So they actually purchased an Ikegami prototype HD monitor in order to preview this 1024 line output. And this was one of the first times that HDTV and computing technology kind of overlapped. And this hardware was eventually used to do the CG in Tron in 1982. So this team then went to Symbolics, and they immediately got to work on Symbolics' second generation 3600 series system. They developed what they called the high-res color system paddle card, which is shown on the right. And that, because if we know anything about Symbolics in here, they used a programming language called Lisp, which was an early object-oriented, like a proto-object-oriented programming language. And it was completely software definable as long as you stayed within the 10 nanosecond range of the DAX on this board. So you could make it progressive, you could do interlace, you could do pretty much any resolution as long as your software allowed it to be, and you had the RAM and all that such. In fact, it was considered kind of hardware HDTV out of the box. In 1985, they were invited to Expo 85 in Tsukuba, Japan, where NHK and Sony talked to the Symbolics folk and said, hey, we have this HDTV standard and we would like your hardware to support it. So they gave the parameters, they went home, the Symbolics team went home, tried it out, and they determined that they didn't need to change anything. It already supported HDTV. So they also determined that if they changed the DAX to ADCs, they could use it as a frame capture board. So it was also one of the first implementations or first high-resolution capture devices. You could then use a paint software to manipulate it and then output another high-resolution image. They then went to the next generation, the 1200 series, and they created an evolution of this high-res color card called the Proton, or the frame thrower as it was marketed. And that leveraged the high color system as a daughter board and then added some floating point processors, full alpha channels so that you could do transparency, and made it a 3D powerhouse. In fact, Sony America's HD Center ended up buying the largest XL1200 example with these cards called the Fat Boy. And that had a custom designed expanded chassis, and it rendered 2 of Symbolics' most well-known shorts called Virtually Yours and The Little Death, and you can see a little preview of that down there. So let's look at another computer company around the other side of the world. They were called Toyo Lynx in Japan. They were a combination of Osaka University and Imagica, the film processing company. And in 1982, they developed a computer called the Lynx 1, and it was called a multi-microcomputer where it leveraged parallel processing in order to perform CG. It was considered one of the first CG computers designed completely in Japan. In 1983, they released pretty much the most well-known usage of the Lynx 1, at least outside the computer graphics industry. And it was the first animated film with CGI called Golgo 13, and you can see a sample of that on the right. In 1985, they released a short called Project Somnium, which they claimed was the world's first CG short made for HDTV. And the only time this, as far as I know, has been shown at SIGGRAPH 1985. Luckily, we found the master tape for this, and we captured it, and we're going to show it for the first time right now. Cool. So not only was that the first HD CG usage, but it also had the Metaball, the old Metaball geometry system, and it had full ray tracing. Pretty interesting. So that's our presentation today. I hope you enjoyed our journey from the very beginning of HDTV to the first implementations of HDTV in digital hardware. We weren't able to talk really about the 90s when digital HDTV transmissions and research really began, but I hope this inspires some of you to learn more about the history, the very interesting, very dramatic history of HDTV, and maybe you'll join us. That would be great. So thank you to all of you for joining us again on our very first presentation, and that's all. Do you have any questions? Okay. All right. Yeah. Go ahead.
All questions, please line up at this Q&A mic. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so the first question I have is that in some of the standards that you listed, some of them are 60 and some of them are 59.94. Now, I'm aware that when they developed the original NTSC standard, they chose they slowed down the horizontal rate, reducing the frame rate to 29.97 or 59.94 because the color subcarrier of 3.57 or 3.58 megahertz, it would interfere with the audio. But did they not like, what was the idea why there's both 59.94 and 60?
That's a really good question. So the difficulty there is that you had to do something called standards conversion to switch between the different frame rates. Standards conversion is not very easy. You have to have frame buffering, you have to have a lot of mathematics behind to make the frame conversion easy. And since they wanted HDTV to also be backwards compatible with standard definition, you had to then take a 60 frames per second recording and convert it to 59.94, which sounds, at first glance maybe easy, But the hardware required for that, the first prototype hardware was 3 racks worth of equipment. So a lot of the other proposed standards were like, we got a whole standard definition system. Why reinvent the wheel with this slight modification? We got all this content. Let's ease into let's just do the resolution thing first, and then visit the frame rate thing later. So it was kind of Hollywood. It was kind of a little political, and it was kind of just engineering. So.
Okay. First one, quick one. Do you have a link to your Discord?
Yeah. So if you scan that QR code, that'll give you links to the Discord. It'll take you to the link tree. We got YouTube on there and social medias and all those things.
Okay. Second of all, this is the bigger one. You mentioned all the 100 different standards, like someone from Europe. Are you familiar with? I believe it's multiplex analog components, or MAC, or is it?
Yeah. So MAC was an improvement to standard definition. It wasn't really considered. So there were actually like 3 efforts. It was like a stepping stone system that Japan was looking into. They were going to do IDTV, then EDTV, then HDTV. IDTV being an improved television standard, and MAC kind of fit in there. EDTV was like progressive scan, which looked better but wasn't necessarily more picture information, but it was less processing power. And then HDTV was like the final goal. So MAC was kind of that stepping stone. And in that video I showed you with the MUSE example, in that full video, they kind of show HDTV versus MAC. And they're like, well, HDTV looks nicer because it's higher resolution. MAC is just like better color, not as good, right? So.
Yeah, I'm wondering where MPEG-2 eventually, and the MPEG standard eventually plays a role.
Yeah, so that actually grew out of the digital HD standard in the 90s, and that in itself is a whole story because a lot of American companies, again, started thrhrowing their hat into the ring. And they
I believe it actually started originally as a way for video conferencing through ISDN, and we already have this tech, might as well use it.
There's a bunch of different branches of engineering where a lot of that video technology came from. I agree. Anyone else? Any other questions?
Yeah, I just had more of a request, if anything else. The Junko Mihara, you posted part 1 for here in the Rudy City. I'm just wondering, is that part 2 ever going to be coming out to the channel?
I think I may have posted part 2.
Oh, okay.
You might want to just check out my YouTube channel one more time.
Okay. I guess the other question, with YouTube being what it is, with takedowns and whatnot, have you thought about alternatives as far as like how to archive those in case strikes come for videos and whatnot?
Sure. That is a really good question, and I mentioned in the very beginning, I've met with a lot of directors, a lot of people in the industry. So there's this fine line between what I do and what makes directors happy and the people in the industry happy. So, for example, I do try to do exactly what you said and try to archive with permanence. And we were able to achieve that, for example, with the Symbolics shorts, the Virtually Yours. I reached out to one of the VPs who helped a lot with these slides. And he basically authorized the release commercially of that. And so that was a big victory for us, because now you can go to Internet Archive and download it and do whatever you want with it as long as it's not commercial. So we're working towards that. We're hoping that some of our archive can eventually be released in like physical formats and those sort of things.
So I see the long road that 1920 by 1080 took to becoming a reality, but I remember growing up that HD television was first 1280 by 720, and 1080 was full HD, and that came later. So where along the way did we get this downgraded, 720p junk? Like, I don't see that anywhere here, and no one liked it. Everyone wanted 1080.
So that is a very good question. So that goes into the computer end of things. There was this, so the Japanese system, which in itself, someone said in the very beginning, there was a French HD system, right? Everything kind of evolved, right? There's really no true beginning, right? The 720 system kind of came as a response because RCA was doing some research into like a high resolution picture system, not necessarily for broadcast, but for technological reasons. And they had independently come up with this the idea of progressive progressive pictures look really nice on like a tube TV. And they thought that was the future. And there were some other advantages. In addition, it was easier with computing technology. So you had a sector of the market that had kind of developed this progressive system independently, and they were like, we want progressive, we want progressive. And then you had Japan who was like, we have a full production system in our full HD or eventually 1080 format. And so you had this like head-to-head bashing, and that eventually kind of resulted in what we have in digital TV now.
So now I
HDSC.
understand why
Yeah.
it's kind of 720p versus 1080i.
Exactly.
Okay. That
Exactly.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that they were two kind of separate things that eventually kind of converged.
Exactly. Yeah. All this is kind of like buried under a lot of politics. It's buried a lot of white papers, and that's what makes it so interesting. It's kind of like extracting information and finding all these stories on how what we take for granted now is really an evolution of all these engineers, all these politicians, all this money, and this worldwide effort to come together and create something that made a little bit of everybody happy, I think. So, thank you. Next.
Hi. So as you were showing the early clips and talking about the early standards, a lot of this was Japanese. I'm just curious, and then you're obviously involved in a lot of the efforts to recover these and restore these. Is there an appreciation for these standards in Japan itself as a historical artifact, or is this something that's mostly being carried on abroad now?
So I think it's starting to hit that age where it's starting to be appreciated. In Japan, I'm not exactly sure. I want to say in the Tokyo area, there's an NHK museum, and if you go there, they actually have one of their first cameras in there. They have some monitors and things. They have done like some specials on like Takashi Fujio was interviewed. He passed away a dozen or so years ago. And they did make some efforts, but I think it's now hitting that like 30-year cycle where it became a standard, where we're starting to now look back and be like, oh, this was actually like very important to modern technology in general. So thank you. That's a great question. Okay, well, one story before I conclude, I guess. So I had mentioned there's an XL1200 system that Sony bought, right? There's a rumor that system still exists in the Sony HD Center, and but there's been a couple people who have tried to find it, but apparently it's under a bunch of paperwork. So if anyone knows anybody at Sony, you can talk to them and see, hey, do you know about the Fat Boy? So anyways, thank you so much for attending. I appreciate it.